here. All right. Hey, guys, welcome. I'm Jason, and I'm so excited to have all these folks joining me today. And so I will let them introduce themselves because I cannot do them justice. So if you guys would go around. Kim, do you want to start?
Okay, sure. I have no idea what to say. My name is Kim Hogg. I am working currently at Chadwick International with Jason and two of our other guests today. I'm currently teaching design. I am also an English teacher, and we've been doing podcasting at our school through both English classes and with a club for a couple of years now. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that today.
Cool. My turn.
Sure.
My name is Alex, as you can see down over. Let's see if I can get it right over there. So I'm a secondary tech coach, and I'm working with. Wait, no, there I got it right. Okay, I'm working with Kim and Jason and Bree. Over there.
She's down there.
There, over there. Okay, it's like the Brady Bunch. Got to get all the squares right. I've just moved to Korea. In the last 6 months, I was living in Vietnam before that. And I am the host of a podcast called The EdTech Lens. And I talk to different education specialists and talk to them about what technology means to them. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Sarah, you want to go? Yeah.
Sure. I don't know how skilled I am at pointing.
It's harder than you think.
It's the opposite of what you think. Hello.
Well, my name is there. I think you can figure it out. But my name is.
We can see it.
I know. I'm just realizing that I didn't put my last name. But my name is Sara Candela. I work with nobody here. I know Jason kind of through what I do. And so I am a veteran English teacher. I taught English in New York for 15 years. And now I am in Los Angeles, which is a whole other story. But now I work with, first of all, I host a podcast called From Bell to Bell, which is which Jason has been on, and his episode has not been released.
That's okay. It's coming.
The fact that it was 4.5 hours long. Wow. And on my podcast, I invite teachers to pick films and television shows that take place in schools, and we talk about the way the media portrays the culture of the school environment and teachers' jobs and the way students and teachers are treated in the media and society. So we talk about that. We laugh a lot. We giggle for 4 hours. We try to take a serious lens. But what I do now, since I've left teaching, is I work with Synth, which is an online micro kind of mini podcasting platform that has kind of taken off amongst educators. So that is kind of how Jason and I got connected, because he became last year one of our ambassadors for Synth.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
I'll go. I'm also a Chadwick person. My name is Briana. I've been there for 6 years in different capacities. My background is mostly in literature, but also second and many more language learning. Most kids come to us today being more than bilingual. And so English is the language of instruction, but it's definitely not their mother tongue. So podcasting has been really cool in that way, that it allows another medium for expression. And so I've really enjoyed watching my kids blossom in ways when the screen is a little bit too intense, or getting up in front of others is too intense. So I've been in Korea for 6 years, and happy to be here today.
Well, I'm super excited to have all you guys, and you all got very different experiences, which is why I thought it'd be really neat to have all of us on talking about this thing. And ironically, I was actually miking myself up and sharing lessons with students 15 years ago. I would record myself because the students traveled a long way on buses, and I would give them the file on a USB thumb drive or something. And I didn't realize I was podcasting, but that's what I was doing. I didn't have intros or outros, but it was still what it was. And so, but the language thing is a big part of the podcasting puzzle, especially internationally, is that I love Synth, little plug there, with the first 60 seconds being able to transcribe what you're saying, which is really awesome for kids who language, is new. And so it's been really a fun journey, and I enjoy just doing podcasting for fun. I'm a nerd like that, so I guess.
No.
It helps having a great voice too. You just got
You
the
don't like
voice for radio.
podcasting.
Oh, come on, man. I have the voice face for radio. So
Face for
anyway. So can you guys talk a little bit about how you're actually using podcasting sort of in, and Sarah, I know you're out of the classroom, but what kind of applications can we use it for in education?
You want me to go first?
Sure, go right ahead.
I didn't know if you were asking me directly or
No, it's totally cool.
So as far as, I mean, I can talk about what we have seen teachers using synth for, and that has kind of developed over the last year or so, working with ambassadors like yourself who have given me a lot of ideas based on what they were naturally using voice for. And a lot of that started with them kind of seeing a need for students to be a little bit less attached to their screens at all times. So rather than relying on recording platforms that maybe completely rely on video or you know, need that component to really function, using audio kind of opened up a little bit more space to be creative and to be imaginative and kind of go from there. So it's more than just, and this goes for not just using synth, but it's more than just podcasting. It's using it for formative assessment, using it for you know, now that we're facing all these closures and potential distant learning here, like that's what we're thinking about. I'm in California, but you know, I taught in New York, so all of my friends, and I actually was just in New York last week, so all of my teacher friends are over there. So you know, because I never taught on this side of the country, so all my teacher friends are in New York, and they're all, you know, also talking to me about ways that they can. I'm like sending them links. I'm like, now you wish you listened to me last year when I was trying to train you. When I was trying to train you on using synth for podcast. Ignored me. And so now I'm like texting like 40 people the link today. I'm like, hey, no school on Monday. Guess what?
There you go.
But it seems to be,
have a look.
So it seems to be a way. I mean, just a couple hours before we went live on this broadcast, a couple of our ambassadors were tweeting about ways that they were using it just this week, kind of in prepping for projects. We saw somebody using it for a poetry assignment where students obviously couldn't or are not able to recite, or, you know, things that are meant to be heard or read out loud, like poetry, but you don't need to see someone reading it out loud. They're using something like that to record and hear each other and comments on each other. And then a teacher can give feedback directly. But the uses are endless, and I don't want to take up everybody's space, but I would also love to hear how people are using it in their rooms now, or using podcasting and even not just creating, but also listening as well, because that's I think an important thing when we think about having to take learning outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
Right.
If I can jump in here.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, Bree.
No, it's okay.
I wanted to catch on to what you were talking about in terms of the distance learning needs and things that are starting to become a reality outside of East Asia for a lot of people. And one of the things that I can remember from my own experiences as a distance learner was how exhausting it was to get everything just in text all the time, whether that was my communications with people, my instructions, my lessons, my research. All of that was done via text, and I craved being able to hear a voice. And I think that's something that, as a lot of us are looking at how we use podcasting, and we're thinking in particular about the distance learning situation that a lot of us are up against for the very first time, that even if it's a little uncomfortable, I would really encourage people to take the time to try it out and to see if they're able to do some kind of instruction, even with audio, to try to give people another avenue into how they're accessing information and how they're processing information, just to give them a break from the text-based version of life. So I would just step in and say that.
Yeah. I think to just add on to what you're saying, Kim, I'm reading so many headlines about how they're going to continue education if you're not a one-to-one school, for example.
Right.
And many, many children have cell phones. And what's great about podcasting is you can do so much of it with a handheld device. You can still do school with podcasting, with recordings, without having to rely so much on a laptop. And that's great if you're, a school that comes from a particular demographic, but a lot of people around the world are going to be, working at a minimal level of tech access, I would say.
Right.
And Bree, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
That was such a great conversation. I didn't want to interrupt. Yeah, I'm up over here. I think also I like a good time for me to jump in after hearing Bree talk was I'd like to add on the idea that we can also document things where you're able to record it and you're always able to come back to something. And I think that's why I started to get into podcasting this year. We have a bunch of great speakers come to our school, and they come for a one-off, and they leave, and we didn't really have any way of remembering all of these great people that had come through. So a great moment in my life that I remember is having read Alfie Kohn and then him coming to speak, and that was like so exciting for me, but I didn't have a chance to really speak to him or interview him. And after that experience, when he had gone, I thought to myself, I wish I had something to document it or to come back to, or maybe even to share with others. So I was speaking to our head of professional development at our school, and I asked him would it be all right each time we have a speaker come through, could I interview them and, talk to them about their work, but through the perspective of technology. So that's how my podcast was born. So I've had only 2 episodes so far, but it hopefully is going to be this repository where we have more people coming through, and then we can always come back. And, imagine if a teacher was gone and they didn't have the chance to attend that session with that speaker. This podcast would potentially be able to be some sort of document for them. And I think that's my kind of connection to what Bree was saying also during school closures. Students that are, working on something, they'd be able to document their thinking or their work. And it's another form of blogging. It can be a reflection. It can be a snapshot in time. So I really like that element to it.
Yeah. I really love the idea of podcasting as a text too. And I think that probably from the literature background, there's so many good stories that you can listen to. I think my favorite that's not kid friendly is like S-Town. I feel like I've listened to it a few times over the years. It's just fabulous, right? And it's a novel. And I think if we can, as a society, create more text that kids can hear, like this young adult lit version, instead of just simply saying it's an audiobook, but what if it was truly just a podcast? And I hope that's an area that really explodes in the near future. I know that it exists, but it would be cool if schools embraced it more in the future.
Yeah, the narrative side of like YA podcasting. Almost. There needs to be more of a brand of that, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's a real lack outside of like a couple of kid-geared science podcasts and a few other things. There's not really much that's narrative that's geared towards kids in that YA kind of demographic.
Right.
So
the narrative that I see a lot that gains the most traction is for very little kids.
Right. I do too.
And to be a short 10, 15 minute, because they can't handle, a length very much longer than that, especially with no visual attached to it. So, they're very short little narrative bursts almost, but there's really nothing substantial and that's why, teachers of, 8th, 9th, 10th graders wind up giving them things like Serial and S-Town because they're reading adult novels in school. So there's no bridge.
Well, and as a teacher, you're like, should I be sharing this? But man, it's good. You'll love it.
You'll see abridged teacher versions of Serial pop up everywhere. And I'm like, how did they manage that?
Yeah, I'm going to check that out.
I've never listened to them, but I have seen people say like, hey, I have an abridged version of Serial, or only listen to this episode with your 10th graders. I'm like, great. That would work.
That was actually a big question that we had with our 10th graders when we did our media studies unit the last couple of years, because we did play the first episode of Serial with our kids. And so we looked at the other texts that we had and the language content and things like that, and made a decision that, well, it's on par with the other books that we're teaching. And so for 10th graders, we felt it was an okay decision to make, and incredibly engaging. incredibly engaging, but they loved it, and it really hooked them into the model of podcasting. And just to kind of get back to part of the original question you had there, Jason.
It's okay. I said it was free
He
form,
doesn't
man.
remember.
What was the original question? I don't even
There's no
remember.
plan.
But so what we did when we were looking at media studies was examining this newer form of media. And one of the activities that students had the option to choose for their final assessment was to create a podcast of their own. And we had some really amazing student content come out of that was just basically so mind-blowing that we had to form a club. That was just, there was no way around it. And so I think thinking about it as literature, thinking about it as a text, and then when you see the kids really get engaged with it, it creates this total opportunity for them to start exploring their own voice and putting their own ideas out into the world, which is just fantastic. I love it so much.
The podcasts you guys make are so much fun to listen to.
They're
Hearing the youth
really
voice
amazing.
and hearing them express themselves as well, it's really enjoyable. It seems like when I tune in, they're just being themselves. They don't feel like there's any restriction. It's really cool that school can be that place to express themselves. So bravo for that. It's really a lot of fun to listen to.
It's been a lot of fun to do. We are just over 1 year into production, and with the exception of our holidays and now this distance learning situation that we're in, we've been able to put out a weekly show consistently since last January, which is amazing. And we've just switched up our format, so it's incredible. We've decided to switch up our format and pull out of our long format stuff from our kind of weekly announcements thing that we've been doing. And so we moved to a weekly announcement show that is both broadcast within the school and broadcast online, and have moved to doing a more monthly based podcast for the longer format to give students the opportunity to develop it further and create something that's a higher quality, that's more in tune with their goals and what they would like to do. So that's been tricky. Our first episode has been pushed back like 6 times now because of our publishers. So we haven't actually launched our first episode, but we have all the tape ready to go. It's just a matter of us having a meeting and going over our rough cuts and figuring out where we want to take it. So hopefully we'll be back in school in April and we can get that done.
That sounds like every new podcaster out there. I have a lot of tape recorded, but I just haven't recorded.
Just need to edit.
Or it just needs editing.
Yeah, from 4.5 hours.
I've been telling Jason that since September.
It's okay. It'll be totally worth it. I know. It'll be totally worth it. Sarah, were you using any podcasting when you were teaching English at all?
No, and it's actually interesting. I mean, it's a longer story than I can get into here, but it's one of the reasons that I decided to shift out of education. And I had been thinking about it for some time because I had been kind of dabbling in podcasting myself a little bit, but as a lot of teachers, especially English teachers, writing teachers, like find that it takes so much of yourself to dedicate to that job that I found I had very little mental space to kind of to do anything really substantial outside of that. On my own, I couldn't gain traction like with learning what I needed to do and finding time for that. So I started to think about what, and I also had students who knew that I was very interested in podcasting, and they didn't know what it was, but they would see me doing little things and we're talking about it or I would use some audio in class sometimes, but never, I didn't record with them, but they started to ask, and I was the what is it called? Newspaper advisor. I was like, what is that thing I did forever? And
he's blocked it now. It's gone.
I'm like, I taught journalism, but what was that thing that we produced something, a product? I taught journalism and I was a newspaper moderator for many years. And in my last year, my newspaper students were the ones that really started to approach me and gave me this idea of like, can we sort of merge the two things and can we put out some sort of audio product? But the funding, like I had to put together a crazy proposal just to get, I mean, they wanted it to be part of the newspaper. It was a whole big thing, but and then getting the equipment. And I worked at a performing arts high school, so the equipment wouldn't have been too far off, from what we already had. But yeah, anyway, like that, hearing the interest from even just that small group of journalist kids that I had, that kind of gave me the idea that maybe there's something in here that I could explore, that would give me room to kind of do more outside of the classroom. So, that's kind of what led me to this crazy transitional world that I'm in now. But it was the idea of doing a little bit more with this medium that really is very exciting to me. So all of that has led me to this very moment. Where we're all quarantined to our houses.
That's right.
Talking on the
we
internet.
have to use it to communicate. Exactly.
Yes. And now people want to be my friend because I know how to use all the things.
That's right. Oh, we all understand exactly what
We
you're
all
saying.
do.
Trust me.
New friends.
We've been feeling it for the last month.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
Hey, Bree, I want to ask you about the project you've done with is it eighth grade that you were doing it with?
Yes. Yeah. We just embedded it into a unit of inquiry, and the students were looking at tech and innovations. And I think the way the unit had been taught for a long time was to look at ancient innovations, and we started just wanted to get away from that, make it more applicable to life. And the way it ended up unfolding was that we wanted the kids to find an innovation that they were sort of interested in exploring deeper, but then throughout the unit, part of the formative work was for them to listen to podcasts to sort of craft in their minds how they envisioned theirs to look, right? So did they want it to be more informative, educational? What tone did they want to take on? And then they didn't know who they were going to be working with. It was really a matter of creating like a cull of topics that they were interested in and then pairing them up based on interest. And we ended up anything from like the Hyperloop to electric cars. Some wanted to do pieces of social media, but I was really surprised about how many kids wanted to do things that were rather specific and even still in like AI regarding the coronavirus, for example. So something rather specific. And they ended up doing their research because they had to have research as part of it. It needed to actually have elements of information that could be relied upon. We really wanted them to get away from just having dialogue back and forth that didn't really have substance, right? Which is easy to do in like a 6-minute podcast. And they went through the whole thing. They wrote their own script. I worked with 2 colleagues in this group and got time. They recorded, they re-recorded, they listened to themselves. It was really fascinating for them to realize they thought 6 minutes would be so hard in terms of time to fill. And then they were into like 10 minutes and they, how do you get concise quickly, but how do you also decide what information is worth your audience's time? Right. And so I don't think I've ever taught anything where that was quite so profound for my kids. Because when you're teaching how to edit yourself as a writer, you're supposed to be thinking about the audience, but you're not. You're going to give it to your teacher. And there's never a time when the audience really has to then like your show or comment back on your show. And so it's real applicable to go through that process, share it. They did their own cover art. We put it on Stitcher. I was like, not Sketcher, Stitcher. So they actually had,
you put your shoes on. That's good.
Yeah. Right. So they had to, publish it and then listen to each other's. And then that's how we actually used Kim's podcast with the older students as like a model. You could have something like this. And I believe last year we ended up having guest hosts from my class that ended up on Kim's show at the beginning of the following year. So it definitely spiraled into something bigger than itself at the school. And I do think it can be a force of change within a school. I could see how you could really do podcasts about issues within a school and do a deep dive. You could also, like I said, teach research skills, but you could also do surveys and you could gather data and you could share it. And I think that could be a real tool to change issues of school climate. So I think it can actually be bigger than itself, which is cool.
That's a
Yeah,
really
you're
interesting
reminding
idea.
me as you guys talk about using podcasting with students and what they've done. You're reminding me that around this time last year, we were preparing to launch our student podcast challenge with Synth,
Mm-hmm.
which
Oh yeah.
was new and they hadn't
Yeah.
done that yet.
Mhm.
And within that, like I can't remember exactly how long. It may have been about a month and a half or almost 2 months that we gave for preparation. So within that time, I received so much like reaching out, like either on Twitter or people directly emailing me or on Medium of teachers with ideas or things they were trying with very young students, like, first graders, second graders, which to me, like I never taught students that young. So to me, what you would do with a student that on a podcast, aside from just like have them read something was beyond me. But I mean, we had a teacher, I believe it was first grade, it was either first grade or kindergarten, who recorded a podcast, like we were saying before, as every week of the year.
Oh, wow.
She recorded it with young kids, and they just you could tell they were reading from scripts, and they just talked about what they were learning that week. So they just came on there and described it, and then they would all like yell together at the end, and their excitement was palpable, and you like wanted to be a part of that learning. And they continued it through the whole year, and it was so great. And so yeah, they were like wound up winning one of our like youngest awards, I think, because it was just adorable. But yeah, we saw so many great projects, and something that you were just saying, Briana, about the research that just made me reminded me of something that came out of that project last year, was that we did have a teacher who actually is one of my ambassadors now, who came up with a research project. I think it was like 10th graders and 9th graders, but really it could be adapted for anybody. But they were using Synth for podcasting and for projects, like project-based assessment and stuff like that. But she used group research where they had topics together. And like we said, like we're not working on, when you're writing, it's so hard to focus on audience and tone or to teach that, and to teach it through, you're producing for an actual, like when they hear the word audience, that means nothing when you're giving someone an essay. I mean, it only means something when you're thinking of a person that's going to, or a group of people that are going to consume it. So, she assigned topics per group, and as they did research, and she had a lot of details that went into this, which I do have a blog on that I could send you.
Okay,
I
sounds
do.
great. I'll put it in the notes.
Yeah, well, she had a detailed plan, but she did. She had them attached to their audio recordings, which you can do in Synth. All of the links to their research. So within each
I like that
audio, within each clip of audio, if the 5 of us were a group and we were researching together on a topic, we could all work on our own time in our own houses or after school or wherever it is. And then whatever research I found, I could talk about it in, just record a piece of whatever. And then I could attach to it the links that linked right back to the research that I found, where I got that information from. And then you guys could add it on your own time. And it becomes like a little mini research podcast, like kind of showing what we've done. So that was cool. It was a very cool thing that came out of something that was just supposed to be a fun contest. And yeah, it just shows the breadth of not only what kids are available, if you make something available to them, what they're capable of, but it shows that creativity that can be sparked when you take them out of like a comfort zone.
Yeah,
that's super cool.
Yeah,
absolutely. Alex, did you want to say something earlier after Bree was finished there?
Yeah, I was just going to say how cool that was, thinking about data in different forms. And I'm somebody who's obsessed with spreadsheets. Anybody that works with me has probably witnessed this. But I think data is really interesting in all of its different formats other than spreadsheets. And I think qualitative data is really interesting because it's a little bit harder to manage, a little bit harder to wrangle, and harder to pull insights out of. It was kind of an interesting idea that Bree was inspiring, and made the idea that you could gather a bunch of different research and interview a bunch of different people. And somewhere like Synth or a podcast could be that collection of different research points.
Mhm.
I wanted to also ask Bree
Hmm.
if there's any kind of other example that you might think of if you were to think of collecting qualitative data like that. I'm just assuming it's qualitative, like interviewing somebody.
I mean, I think so. So Kathy Berger Kay is a educational specialist, and many of us know, but for the listeners, she specializes in experiential education opportunities in your room, within your units, as a pedagogical practice, right? And so I've been experimenting. I met her last fall, and I've been experimenting with this idea that can my children gather qualitative and quantitative data as part of that research? And even if it doesn't make its way into the final script, the point is they went through that research process, right? And it's one of those things. She really highlights this. I did this MISO method, right? So media for M, interview for I, S for survey, and O for observation. And I think it's hard to find authentic ways to always do those things. And I really wanted to build it into what I was already doing with the podcast. So part of this assignment for this year was for them to incorporate an expert opinion. And if that person is just a user of the technology, just a user of the innovation, they can still be an expert, right? A full-time Instagrammer after school can be the person that you want to interview, right? So I feel like it could be qualitative, but I feel like if someone teaches it right and you actually teach them how to do surveying, you could bring that information in if your community is going to be the baseline of information you're gathering, right? I think it really depends on the topic. But I think I think kids would be really engaged if they knew what percentage of other kids at their school believed this or that, right? So like, think of like your procedures or your policies at your school, or student voice. Like, wouldn't that be cool if that could make its way into an episode of a podcast that was serving your student body? So I don't know. I do think it could go both ways.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that your question brought up for me, Alex, I was reminded of a person that I learned about when I was a kid in school. Her name was Helen Creighton, and she was known in my area because she was a very prolific folklorist, and she spent a lot of time going out into her community and collecting stories and oral histories and things like that of people around her. And so I think there's a real opportunity in podcasting for us to have students bring in the stories of their communities, the stories of their cultures and their histories, and to really broaden the base of information that we use to gather historical data and to gather information more broadly. It just gives us a chance to get out of the textbook, as it were, and to get into more authentic, maybe anecdotal, but at least authentic and real stories that bring those students and their cultures and their histories to bear into our classrooms as well. So there's a huge opportunity that I think is also a bit unexplored, but that was kind of one of the things that came to mind when you were asking Bree about her research question.
I really like that idea. I think it's coming back to one of my earlier points too, that it's a form of documenting. And it's a form of recording and archiving and keeping a memory. I'm also my mind is going into another place too, that with young people, they're the YouTube generation. They love anything that's on YouTube, and that instantly gets buy-in because, it's YouTube. It has social capital behind it. And we're talking so much about something that's sort of like this revamped version of radio. We're talking about modern radio that's kind of on demand. You can listen to anytime. You can download it. You can subscribe, And I don't know that young people necessarily have radio as a reference, because YouTube is kind of their go-to media source. And I definitely, I'm a believer. I think that podcasts are incredible because it's less distracting. It helps us to focus on the message rather than any distracting visuals. And it's less about how the person looks. It's more about what they have to say. And, there are a lot of reasons why we can podcast. I don't mean to interview the room, but I'm just curious if anybody had any stance on that. Do you think, is there some way that we can get buy-in with young people? So I just hear that Bree has done a fantastic job with it. And I'm curious how, others might also get buy-in. Kim noticed that there was buy-in. Is there any other way that we can get young people excited when it's primarily voice?
I can say one thing, and that is that it appeals to a certain audience.
Yeah.
Just like anything else. And
Yep.
so even with the podcast that now runs at the school as part of, doing announcements and this and that, we also have, Sarah, for your own reference, we also have a club that does film and video. Okay.
Yep.
Some of those are crossover students and some of them are not, because we do have some students who really love voice. They love,
Yep.
the audio and the richness that can come from just the listening experience versus some incredible filmmakers as well. And we're right in the epicenter of all this parasite paranoia at the moment, because a lot of our kids, their families are connected to the entertainment industry as well.
Okay.
So there's a lot of interest already. So I think we're talking about an ecosystem at our school, which is very different than a lot of other places that you could be in. And so, but I do believe that especially because a lot of kids are bust places and things like that, to have something they could just listen to and then look out the window and think and imagine, I think is a really, really great way. And I think, Alex, you're right. I don't know how many of them have actually ever listened to radio unless they were in the car with their parents and it was on. And even that could be satellite radio or just music. And so I don't know if they've ever just listened to even talk radio. And so I think it's great that you're using Serial, the first episode, because I covered one of Kim's classes. She was out and I had to do that. And the students were completely engaged and did not want to leave when it was time to go. So I do think just the novelty of it being a new medium in a way is good as well. I think with all these school closures, it's a great way for teachers to get their message out to students and for students to respond. And so I've been using Synth as a way to, I give them a prompt and then they go and respond to me. And that's how I'm still keeping a personal touch with my students. And so some of them love it and they're the first to respond, and some of them still don't respond. They hate it. So I think it's really going to be all about.
And they wouldn't respond to you if they were in person.
They wouldn't. The same one.
They're just
aren't
being
responding.
they're just doing that.
It's not new, right?
Yeah.
So I think your question's a good one, Alex. What's anyone else think? Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the time.
Can I follow up on that? Something else that you're just kind of making me imagine there and inspiring in me. I think that young people are in love with YouTube, but as viewers, they are really uncomfortable when I ask them to turn on their cameras.
Oh, sure.
And during all these school closures, we've been doing a lot of Zoom calls or Google Meet calls, and a lot of the kids just want to leave their cameras off. I find that really funny. Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive. I thought, oh man, these kids will love video, and what they ended up really liking was broadcasting from StreamYard and being able to comment without their faces and having that little bit of security. So they're still getting to watch me and Kim. Wait, am I pointing the wrong direction here? Let me point this way. Kim and I touch fingers. Kim and I have been doing a bunch of great broadcasts on StreamYard together to YouTube, and that's been hugely successful for them in that they show up, they're engaging. So I wonder if we're to kind of use that to help paint some sort of vignette of young people today and say, well, they're more of a consumer of video and they're less interested in creating unless they have this, like, I don't know, they're not camera shy. They like to be on camera. So I wonder, in a sense, if podcasting gives them an opportunity to have that safety while still being a creator. And
because most of the time the kids, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I'm done.
Most of the time, the kids that are going to jump on being comfortable with either, turning the video on in an online class or creating video on their own are the kids that are going to jump onto stage on their own too. They're the kids that audition for solos, and they're the kids that are going to for the most part, anyone that's experiencing having to work with students online, the kids that are, like Jason was saying before, the kids that are going to do things or show up for things virtually are almost parallel to the way they would do that in person. But I think podcasting offers a way to change that. You do see, like Bri was saying before, about the emerging behavior that came out of even just trying to fit this what could look like an immense amount of research into a tiny little space, but then realizing how much you can do with that little space and how meaningful that space can become and how important your voice is. And not just your voice physically, but your voice as the power of something that can be heard by your teacher is not the only one listening to this. Like many teachers could be hearing you. She could, they could all be looking, students, like anybody, and then thinking that little piece of knowledge of how they can be influential in a class can then be taken outside of that, where they can think, if I could do this in 4 minutes, what could I do if I reached a broader audience, my community, the world, so I think that podcasting creates a level of comfort amongst, almost like levels of playing field a little bit, for students of all, all types of interest and all types of, different types of creativity and different skills to kind of find what it is that they are not just passionate about, but what they're good at, and find what they, work on, for everything from collaborating to being better at doing something solo. I really feel like it does create a way for students to show who they are and what they're capable of, and explore that and hear that in their peers as well, that other things just don't, that like we're saying, video, or things that take a little bit more courage. You have, if you're a student that's going to do it in video, you're usually the kid that's going to do the same thing in person. So I feel like podcasting changes that a little bit.
I think you nailed it. I think podcasting isn't Shakespeare. Like, it's not meant to be consumed at its highest art form. It's meant to be very digestible for the listener, right? You can clean your house and listen to a podcast. You can go for a walk and listen to a podcast.
You can play it at 2 or 3 times the speed.
Yeah. And
That's true.
Are you going to say
true.
at 2 in the morning?
Yeah, you can do that too. Our kids will do that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's
clean your
the
house at
beauty
2
of
or 3
it.
in the morning.
I mean, you good podcasting requires your attention, right? But it's not so inaccessible for children that they can't even imagine creating it themselves. And that's what I think I really love about the informality of podcasting is at its heart, it's really a good story or a good content is where it's at, but it's not about can you understand the words in the sentence, or do you need closed captioning or a transcription, or the whatever that yellow book we had when we were kids that told us what actually was happening.
Cliff notes.
Thank you.
That yellow book.
That yellow book.
The phone book? Oh.
You didn't have one, Alex.
I think as
I had
well.
Spark Notes. Mine was blue.
Kind of building off what you guys were saying, I think in addition to like the kids that just don't want to be out in public, and that distributed nature of podcasting, how it's just me and the headset, and so it's a very intimate conversation with the listener, but it's also because it's not as public facing as other forms of media. You get the kids and the voices of the kids and the opinions of the kids that don't normally speak out in class in the same way with the same eloquence, and get this incredible insight into their mind, into their world that may be totally missing from class conversations. So even if you're not doing distance education, even if you're in the classroom, I think it's a great opportunity for the kids that don't like to speak out in class to still speak out and to share their ideas with both the teacher and with their peers in a way that is potentially very resonant.
I agree. I think you and I have been having some success with Flipgrid, having our students to have their own little quick videos and responding to a central prompt. But I notice a lot of the time kids will put their thumbs over their webcams or something over it. So they're much more comfortable to share their voices. I mean, they're saying it. That's like data that we could be collecting as well. That teenagers are often uncomfortable. I was also kind of curious too from something Bree said earlier about child protection issues. So often with video or pictures that we post online, we have to cover their faces, we have to make it anonymous, but how does that play in with audio? Are can we still have an authentic audience? Can we still broadcast student voice? And how can we do that appropriately?
One of the choices that we've made in our podcasting is to remove all last names from our podcast.
Okay.
And so we've been really try to be very thoughtful and very intentional in what information we share on the podcast. So anybody that's identified is strictly first name. And I think that allows it to be intimate enough that you get that person's name, you get their voice, but not identifiable enough that they could be, say, searchable online or things like that. So that's kind of what one of the considerations that we've made when it comes to both in the show notes and in the show itself as to how we identify people.
Yeah,
Great.
for the most part, when people use synth, and Jason could probably attest to this since he uses it with students now, it depends on the age of the students in the school that they're in. It really, we find it varies very widely from school district to school district. And sometimes even within a building, different teachers have different, like sometimes they're allowed to, they have pretty much free reign, but within their classroom, they personally don't feel comfortable with certain things. So it and also depends on if they're one-to-one or not. So sometimes we find, and I don't know what Jason does, but he can talk about that. But sometimes we find a teacher just makes one account. And like we said, no one, like you were saying, no one uses their last name. They use one name. And they all, so when something does appear, if something were to appear on the synth platform, it might just say Jason's name. And all you would see, and there might be 25 recordings, but they would all be under his teacher account, and you just hear different voices as you play. They might say, "Hi, my name is Matthew, and I'm in the 10th grade," but you wouldn't know anything.
You'd have to listen to it.
Yeah.
When I was in,
depends.
What I've done, Sarah, is I've turned on the moderation feature. So the approval, the post approval feature, I can still hear it myself, but I don't make it visible. So until I click approve, it's not visible for anyone but me. I made that mistake the first time I used it this year. I left it open, and then kids were starting to comment to other kids instead of commenting to me. And so I ran right in and was like, nope, we're going to put a stop to this. So, and a lot of them didn't want to respond because then other people heard them. And so I went ahead and just made it where I didn't approve them. I just listened to them. And when I say approve them, so I know people can see it, so that anyone could hear my prompt, but they couldn't hear any of the responses.
Right.
And so that was just the way I chose to do it. But I don't think it, and then I am able still to share those responses even without approving them. So the first week that we did distance learning, I did a prompt, and I asked students for their feedback on what was it that they liked and what did they not like about distance learning. And then I shared out some of those responses to the teachers just so they could hear what students were saying. And a lot of them didn't even say their name at the beginning. So that was great. And the big thing that they missed about being together was being together, student contact. And so, but with a podcast, what's nice is you're hearing that voice and you're thinking it's a very intimate sort of setting, but yet you still feel like you're getting to know the person, right? So I know there's podcasts I listen to, I feel like I know that person pretty well because, it's a really personal platform, medium. Right? And and so I think that's one thing I really like. Also, I've some of my students have I've given them just enough information to make them dangerous, and what I mean by that is in lots of ways, but is like showing them how to modulate their voice or showing them how to slightly change it so they're happy with it, because no one's happy with their voice because everyone knows them as their voice, but they don't, because you're just between your ears, right? And so students being able to slightly adjust it to where it sounds more like what they think they sound like often helps too. And so
what they want to sound like.
Or what you want to sound like. So I think you can't really do that with video. You could, but it's a lot easier to do it with audio. And so having that as an option is nice too.
Well, also with video, there's just especially with students, there's just the immediate preoccupation with what they look like and what other people are going to think about them. So what they sound like is way not even just secondary, but sometimes like way on the bottom. Like, what do I look like? What am I gonna say? And how are people going to think about what are they going to think about it? And I think how they sound is probably way at the bottom. So it kind of surfaces that to the top when you eliminate all of that other expectation. Because then when you're only hearing somebody and that's your top priority, the craft of what you're saying that's your output. And I think that, and it feeds into everything else we're saying about what happens when you give students that kind of opportunity.
Absolutely.
It's very compelling.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, listen, we could go all day. I'm telling you, I could just talk about this literally all day long. But what I want to do is just ask very quickly, what's your favorite podcast?
Oh God, you can't ask a pod geek like me.
So I mean, but what are you excited about right now? What is it that you like, and what do you listen to? And each of you tell me, because I'm always looking for new
I'm gonna jump
suggestions.
into my app right now and check.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally
So
got
I know it's awful. I'm doing it.
Well, Alex, you can
everybody
say,
think about
you
their
have
own.
Alex has one on the tip of his tongue. I can tell by the way he's looking.
Oh, really? No, I'm looking at my app.
know.
Right now.
Are you looking
looking
at your app too? Oh my God.
Yeah, I have a couple.
I know what I can say.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, so I listen to Beautiful Anonymous, which is the long name is Beautiful Stories from Anonymous People. And that is some people want to call it storytelling, but it really isn't. It's a very simple premise. And it almost is something that you might even think could be replicated very simply. I don't know, maybe with students, but wait till you hear what it is, and then maybe you can decide. But he's a comedian, Chris Gethard, and he I think they're on like episode 203. So like 5 years ago or so, they decided to just open up phone lines and have people call in.
Oh wow!
And give them 1 hour, and they put a timer on a clock, and his little engineer at the studio tells him when certain time stamps come up and that he has to hurry up with something, and they know they have 1 hour, and they can talk about anything about their lives. They can, and now by this point, they all know, everybody knows they'll ask him how he is, how his baby is, like, so it starts with like a little conversation, and then it gets into, it's my last day before I'm turning myself in tomorrow, and I'm probably going to be in prison for 4 years. And then like literally that was an episode. And then we did a follow-up episode where he actually calls the prison and talks this. It's amazing. Wow. And what you get is, if there's 203 episodes of 203 real people from all over the world who literally have just called to talk about their life. And sometimes it'll just be someone walking their dog through a park for an hour, talking to you about, how they're afraid to get married. Sometimes it'll be really heavy, or or nothing, or a guy who's learning how to play guitar on air.
Okay.
But the focus of the show is mental health. And so the comedian who is the host is known for his it sounds weird to say comedy about mental health, but he addresses mental health issues very head on in the work that he does. So when people call, they know that about him. So they wind up telling him things that you might only hear like sitting with your therapist. So it winds up becoming a show where you really learn the vast, just the vast array of lives that go on that are all happening at the same time, and that you never know what people are going through. And it's every Tuesday, and I look forward to it's almost like it almost is like a second therapy session a week for me, because it's like hearing it sounds funny, but as soon as Tuesday morning comes, I feel like it's this therapeutic experience of hearing him talk to somebody, and I don't know what that person's going to say today. And then he'll tweet out and put on Instagram when he's recording. He tweets the phone number, and he's like, call in now. And I call every single time. And I'm like, I don't know.
What would you talk about?
I don't know.
What story?
And no, what's funny is that every time someone picks up and he goes, hello, and they're like, hi, is this Chris? And he's like, yes. And they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I call every day. And so it almost ties together that
Wow.
old school radio call
Yeah.
feel
Absolutely.
too, of
Yeah.
like
Right.
calling to win a
Number
contest.
3. Exactly.
Yeah. And he's like, yes. And they ask how his baby is.
Wow.
And they're like, oh my God. Well, I just found out my father has cancer. And they're like, oh my God.
Oh man.
So it can go from funny to just devastating in
Oh.
a second. And it's amazing. And
That's
I
rough.
recommend it to everybody I know.
Okay.
But so that's my long pitch for Beautiful Anonymous.
Wow.
Beautiful.
I've just
You
not
didn't
been-
have to look at your app for that, Sarah. You knew what it was.
I,
Come
well,
on.
literally as soon as I opened it, that was the first thing that popped up, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm gonna plug that. It's so universally
Oh, that's great.
able to be digested by so many different people. So I feel like it's not on a specific topic. It's not, it's not anything that you have to be interested in a certain area to like. So I feel like it's something
Okay.
that is widely beautiful stories from anonymous people, and that's what it is. You're not allowed to say who you are.
Oh wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Wow.
It's awesome.
Note taken.
Great.
All right, who's next?
I can go.
Okay.
I've been following, it's NPR, but it's Code Switch. So often, I don't know if you're
I love
familiar,
Code
but
Switch.
oftentimes they have a weekly episode. It really revolves around race and identity, but you would think that there's only so many things you can talk about, and it really does focus on issues that are kind of American centric. So you can look at like marginalized communities like Native American populations, but they don't just look at that. They'll look at maybe a new young adult novel that focuses on a marginalized community.
Right.
Or one of my favorite episodes lately was looking at the xenophobia towards Chinese people in the midst of this coronavirus, right? And actually interviewing people who are second or third generation versus how those people are experiencing America right now compared to their parents, who maybe were the people that braved the journey. Or they'll talk to the author of like who just wrote the Whitney Houston memoir and what it was like to be a Black woman in the 80s that won Grammys, but also had a drug addiction. So it was like she was falling into like the traps that we say people of color fall into, but yet just uncovering some really cool issues. They've gone live to a couple of cities around the US, and I made my mother go last year and get me a poster, and I said, Mom, what do you think? Like, was it as diverse as I imagine it? And she's like, yeah, it actually, she lives in Alabama, and you have this image of who's going to show up in Alabama. And she said it was probably the most diverse group of people she's ever sat in a theater with to watch a live podcast taping. And what better place to talk about it than the heart of the civil rights movement, which is that city in Birmingham, Alabama. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating to not live in the US, but to listen to these episodes from afar. Oftentimes they're contemporary, responding to like what happened in Charlottesville or what's going on with the election that's upcoming. But it's also really fascinating to listen and then process and how you experience life through your gender, your culture, your language, how you identify. So I find it fascinating. It's Code Switch.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah.
I've also
All
been to a
right.
live taping of Beautiful Anonymous too. So.
Have you really? Oh my God.
I'm
All right, Kim or Alex, who we got?
I'm gonna jump in.
Okay.
The beautiful Roman Mars has a podcast called 99% Invisible that I'm sure all of you have heard. Jason warned us he was going to ask us this question, and I was
Except Sarah. Sorry,
Oh,
Sarah.
I didn't know, but I don't need one.
I knew you didn't have to. So
No.
these other guys need to be prepped.
But,
Wow.
I do need to be prepped. I had a really hard time thinking about it. I was like, well, I mean,
It's hard to narrow it down. That's the problem.
It is, because it's like I love Jason's design cast, and then like so
Oh,
she was
come
trying
on.
to pick between
I don't sign your
Jason's
paychecks, Kim.
podcast and
I know.
99% Invisible.
Anyway, as a person who I've been, I don't know, from the time I could hold a hammer and a screwdriver, I was putting things together and taking things apart. And so for me, 99% Invisible is like the podcast investigation of what makes things tick, what makes them the way that they are. And so it's the hidden design in everything is kind of the idea behind it. And so if there's one podcast that I listen to every episode, and that I think I've gone back to episode 1 and listened to every one since, it's probably 99% PI. And they've got like up to almost 400 episodes, and they're so well produced. They're extremely insightful. It's everything from the Sagrada Familia in
Barcelona.
Spain,
Barcelona.
to maps. A couple of weeks ago, they did one episode on who let the dogs out. I
Oh
mean,
wow.
it's all over the map,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I can't stop. It's
Yeah.
just
It's an addiction.
That's the best. Those are the best.
Those
Yep,
are
they
good,
are the
Kim.
best.
That's the whole point.
yeah.
Mhm.
So that was my pick. Sorry, I know I
Alrighty.
just stole Alex.
Okay, so I also love Jason's design
Oh,
podcast.
come on, man. You guys
That's
have got to
one,
stop.
and-
Enough.
All
Enough.
set
I'm done. Mic drop.
Done.
Boom. Okay,
Done.
that answer. No. Okay.
Suddenly he has 1 million downloads tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on?
I would just like 10 downloads, to be honest with you. So I'm going for double digits.
Everybody
I'm only
download.
plugging in for on like 25% of the episodes. So
Yeah, Kim's been on more than I've been on, actually. Should be her
So
podcast.
we all like Kim's design cast.
Kim's design cast is what it really is.
Kim's the new design guy.
What you got,
Okay.
Alex?
I got a real one. I mean, a second
Whoa.
thing. Maybe.
Oh,
Whoa. Whoa.
wow.
Ouch.
No, I mean, no,
No.
slip of the tongue. Sorry. You've all mentioned a bunch of great ones. I have a few is hard to choose from. So one that I've been listening to lately is All Songs Considered. And I
yeah.
think the reason why I like it so much is I think Bob Boylan and Robin Hilton are so likable. And whenever I listen to them talking to each other, you can tell that they're friends. And so I just feel like I'm hanging out with a group of friends, even though I'm on a run and I'm just, by myself in actuality. I really like their back and forth. It's just so pleasant. I really enjoy it. And then for the second reason why I would recommend them as well, is I really like music and they always encourage me to expand what I would listen to. And they bring up such a wide range of great music. And one that really pushed my boundaries of what I would listen to was, I'm trying to remember the person's name. Maybe we can write it in the description later somewhere after I look it up. But it's a German electronic musician, and he usually makes very kind of rigid electronic music. It's always very on the beat. It's electronic music, and so this guy made a bunch of instruments out of wood. And he wanted to make a conceptual album, and it was supposed to be what it would sound like if trees were talking or if trees were communicating. So it's like, it sounds like electronic music, but it's all done by hand, and it's a bunch of wood hitting one another, like striking one another. It sounds so cool. And so I was just walking around yesterday, going around in the city and just kind of getting lost in thoughts. And they brought up this incredible music. And then we listened to the new Corner Shop album, and we listened to all these other great things. I really enjoy the breadth in the different music that they bring up. So All Songs Considered, pretty good.
Yeah,
Great.
that's an excellent choice.
That is a good choice.
I
Now
approve
I'm
all
going
your
to do the
choices.
same. I'm going to do the same thing. I was going to say that it was From Bell to Bell, but I haven't heard a new episode in a while.
Oh my
so-
God.
I'm sorry, Sarah. I had to do it, man.
I know.
I'm
We
just
should
kidding.
Stay up all
I'm
have
just
had
kidding.
my co-host Andy. We should have had him on too. So that
Yeah, I meant, I thought about that after we started recording. I thought, oh, Andy, where's Andy?
he's
He would have
home
left
with-
by now. Yeah, he'd have left by now and eaten pizza or something. But, but
See why our podcast was 4 hours long.
It went 4
hours. Right?
but I'm a Southerner, and so I like to tell stories.
No
and
way.
So I know you're surprised, aren't you, Bree?
Shocking.
Being a fellow
Shocked.
Southerner. Come on now.
No
Anyway, so
idea.
there's a podcast I've just started listening to, and I really enjoy. I shared this with Bree actually. It's called The Bitter Southerner,
Yes.
and
Wow,
they have
what? I
a whole
do not know.
episode just about the Waffle House, and so it is fantastic. And so I'll make sure to.
Okra.
What's that? Yeah, I'm
got a
sure there's
whole
an
episode
okra
about
one
okra.
somewhere.
Oh, there is. I've heard it. It's great.
Oh, great. Yeah. So the Bitter Southerner, I think, is what, and I found it through NPR. So it's actually syndicated through NPR. And it's really good because it's very homey and very relatable, and it makes me miss home almost. And so, but yeah, that one's really good.
Jason,
What's
Georgia?
that?
Are you
I'm from
Georgia?
Atlanta. Yes,
Atlanta,
ma'am.
So I thought.
Yes,
okay.
ma'am. So hot Atlanta.
And
So,
somebody that like,
but
just that doesn't have a whole lot of perspective into the South. has a
Yes.
very well, I mean, just it gets a whole lot of stereotypical
Mhm.
input about what the South is like. Being able to listen to that podcast is
Yeah.
eye-opening and beautiful. And
Yeah.
I want to, yeah. I'll
Have
give
you
a
heard
little
it
plug
before
too.
too then, Kim?
I just got exposed to it a couple of weeks ago. A friend of ours
Yeah.
who's from North Carolina came up and she's
Mhm.
like talking about it, and she's like, "You got to listen to it." And so I said,
Yeah.
"Okay." And
Yeah.
it's incredible. It's so
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and it doesn't isolate or exclude people from listening
Mhm.
to it who aren't Southern. In fact,
Yeah.
it's really more about being a Southern ambassador almost. But and the guy's voice is really untrained in a sense. You know, he's just really
Mhm.
real, and so I've enjoyed listening. The Waffle House episode is just fantastic. So you all have to listen to it now. All about scattered and covered and smothered. So it's really good stuff. And so.
Don't listen when you're
As-
hungry.
Yeah, as a language person, you guys would really, language folks, you'd really love it. But well, listen, guys, thank you guys so much for being here.
Yeah.
I went way longer than I thought we would, but thanks again, Sarah, for that.
I was gonna say,
We
you
always go
invited me.
way too
You
long. We always
invited
go way
me.
too long.
This
But
should
that's
be, we
okay.
should do it from bell to bell of just this group
Just
right
this.
here.
That's
'Cause
right.
right.
We're
I
gonna do
miss,
it.
this is what I miss about teaching. I miss having colleagues that I can just
Yeah.
Jam out.
with. I don't
Absolutely.
have
man.
Totally.
to.
Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
but you guys have been great guests. You've been very gracious, and thank you so much. And I'm actually going to strip the audio from this and make it into a podcast, ironically. So
Yeah,
be on the
we're very
lookout for
meta
that.
Here, very
We're
meta.
going to go for 10 downloads. That's the goal. And so there you go.
Nice. Nice.
Kim Design Cast. So thanks so much, guys. I appreciate
Thanks,
you being
Jason.
here.
Thanks so much for having us. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye, peeps.